It's been a really long day. I told you I'd make the video. It's what, 9:30? Just now sitting down to eat dinner. Let's talk about communism. Hooray!
사실은
So for your test tomorrow, not tomorrow, sorry, wrong day again. Your test is on Wednesday, but tomorrow we'll be doing Jeopardy, so hopefully you guys are prepared for that. I mean, by tomorrow, I'd probably mean today, because this thing will probably be posted by like 11:45 tonight, but hey, we'll get it done. So we're going to go over the basics of the second industrial revolution all the way to communism and how we get to this point and how the world is starting to take shape before we get into the 20th century. So we're in that late 1800s push. I mean, we haven't really talked about what's going on in China and Japan, which we will after this test is over. But there is a huge push on the West of a change of what we would call the financial status of our world. So we're going to see two new financial world orders starting to rise up with the prototypical versions of capitalism that we would see coming out of the Industrial Revolution, and then the push against capitalism that we would see coming from Europe, which is what we would now refer to as communism, or at least what would be Marxism by, of course, Karl Marx and Frederick Engels in the 1840s. So we're going to talk about that today. So hopefully you guys have your note cards ready for your test tomorrow. Wednesday. Your test is on Wednesday. I don't want to keep saying that, but it's just out of habit. I just keep saying it. So let's go ahead and get started. So if we want to go back all the way to the beginning of Industrial Revolution, we know that the Industrial Revolution was an era in which people were moving from agrarian lifestyles into the cities and into more urban centers. Now, the pull here was is that there was a new uprise in new technology like spinning jennies, manufacturing systems, the cotton gin in America in terms of the cotton production. We would see textile factories blowing up everywhere, the rise in the invention of steam engines and steam powered machinery, and eventually the rise of electricity and locomotives, which we get all these different goods that were being manufactured at the time from place to place. So we would see this real big swelling of new technology, new industry, and new business opportunities for millions, if not billions, around the world. So, what does that have to do with the creation of things like communism, if you will? Well, because we have these access, these two types of industries, what we're going to see is that people are going to start to have a very different opinion onto the future of where society is going to go based on how industries were starting to rise. Now, for a long time, nationalism was seen as the end all be all of governmental systems and power. We would see that nationalism, in terms of pride of your country, became very important, which it was still was. And we would see nationalism have its moments, especially moving forward when we get into World War One. However, the pride in an industry, the pride in company, and their loyalty in industry and company would become very powerful at this point. We're starting to see the rise of a new class of citizens, not based on a hereditary value. So people who were born into like a monarchy, if you will. This is money starts to talk. We would see the rise of the free market system. Now we remember a long time ago we talked about laissez-faire politics or laissez-faire governments. These are governments that really kind of kept their hands out of the cookie jar, if you will, of how businesses could operate. So they wanted to create a true free market. So if we think back to that guy Adam Smith, he was the guy who came up with the wealth of nations, this idea that countries should be their own countries should let their own companies and industries let them loose, let them use the market, the idea of the invisible hand, free market. The people will decide what companies will thrive and survive and which ones will fail and will ultimately go out of business. So it's important that we remember that idea that Adam Smith came up with, because when laissez-faire policies come into place, we would see the rise of titans, the titans of industry, right? So these would be the people who would take advantage of these laissez-faire policies and create what we would now call monopolies with these large corporations that would control every facet of a business, thus keeping people effectively out of the business. So when we say that, we would think of, for example, Andrew Carnegie, who ran steel. We would think of Rockefeller with oil. We would think of these industrial titans who controlled their industry so much that there was really no way, no barrier of entry to get in. Unless you were Carnegie, you didn't do steel. That's kind of the way it was. So the positives are people who come from nothing, like Carnegie himself, who came from poverty, would rise and could rise up and become very wealthy. but the access to the opportunity was limited because of the creation of these excuse me, because of the creation of these monopoly-like states or corporations, if you will, um, that you really couldn't break into unless you were part of that corporation itself. But there was another problem that was gonna come of this. What's the problem with monopolies? Why is it that in 2024 monopolies are illegal? We have antitrust laws that stop companies from completely controlling an entire industry without any competition. Well, the problem we're gonna find is it's not necessarily with the products that they're producing. The product would be fine, still was good. The oil was perfectly fine. It was what happens to the workers, the people who actually go and produce all the materials. Well, if there's no competition and there's no government um, oversight in terms of how you would control these industries, there's no one to tell someone, hey, you can't do that. Hey, you can't treat workers that way. Hey, you need to pay them a certain amount. They should only work this many hours. They should have these type of living conditions. There was nobody there to create those systems. And this is one of the downturns and one of the flaws of the Industrial Revolution and capitalism to an extent. Unfeathered capitalism, unrestrained capitalism can lead to abuse of workers, and that's what we would see during this time. And we see some of the abuse of the workers that would take in these situations where we would see the rise in epidemics that would go through these cities like wildfires. So we would see things like tuberculosis and cholera and diphtheria and all these really highly communicable or transmittable diseases that would go and run roughshod over pretty much everybody in these urban development buildings that they would live in. So remember the tenement buildings on the last Jeopardy game we played. So you remember these buildings that they would live in like such horrific squalor conditions with horrific hygiene, lack of medical care, lack of education. Children were working from pretty much the age of 6 or 7. I mean, we saw infant mortality rate at an all-time high. Most children didn't make it past the age of 5. It was a really rough time to be alive. And so when this was starting to spread, not just in America or in Europe, it was starting to spread around the world, people started having questions as to whether or not this was ultimately the best system. Now, of course, this wasn't what the capitalism that we see today is. This is a capitalism with no restraints and restrictions. And of course, over time, we would come to realize that we probably should put some things on it. But there would be a new dawn that would come. And let's just say there would be a red shift moving forward. Ladies and gentlemen, that red wave would be communism. I thought we'd put some dramatic effect with the red there, but it's okay. So communism would come into about when a couple of gentlemen from Germany would come up with a concept that he would actually, in his book, call Marxism. And this would, of course, be by Karl Marx. Now, Karl Marx had lived during the Industrial Revolution and saw the some of the horrors that comes out of the Industrial Revolution, and he starts to claim that this clearly isn't the best path forward to mankind, and he believes that capitalism simply is a stepping stone for when mankind needs to get to. So in his writings, he begins to come up with the principles of what he would call Marxism, which later on we would now call communism. And this was the idea that there were two essential classes of people. And this is really important for the test on Wednesday that you guys need to know. So you have what's called the proletariat. This is the working class citizens, the everyday people who go to work in the factories, do their jobs, get paid little work, and get paid little money for the hours that they do work and have to struggle, and they don't see a lot of compensation from the money that is generated from their work. And then you'd have this class of citizens known as the bourgeoisie. Very fancy. So when you think of the bougie bourgeoisie. So the bougie bourgeoisie, these are the wealthy, the elites, the business owners, the upstairs, if you will. So in fact, if you recall in your notes, there was that the idea that we have the downstairs and the upstairs. Well, the downstairs are the people who are working in the factory, and the upstairs are the people who make the money and benefit from it. So remember, proletariat is the downstairs, the bourgeoisie is the upstairs. So when we have those two classifications of people, what Marx is arguing is that there should be really no class system. Everybody should have some type of equality or be treated equally within society. But how do we get to this point? So now that creates that idea of the political staircase, if you will, of what Karl Marx believed in. So the bottom of the staircase was feudalism, and that was the system that they had gotten out of centuries ago. The ideas of kings and queens, and the people were serfs and were owned by the land, and their lords provided them protection as long as they submitted to their will. This was like the bottom of the staircase. He believed that's the most primitive form of governmental system. The next step up would be then, in his mind, capitalism. This idea that people would be competitive based on Darwinian theory. So you think of people think of the survival of the fittest. Only the strong will survive, and the perish shall weak. So the weak shall perish. It's been a long day, and so we he would see that as only the next step up. Now, this is where we get into Marxist theory. So the next step up would be now what we call socialism. Now, modern day socialism is a little bit different, but let's go over the socialism that he has in mind. This is going to sound oddly familiar to some of the people that we've talked about in the past. So, socialism is the concept where the proletariat would actually take power from the bourgeoisie. So, there would be some grand form of uprising, some overthrow. Let's be fair, it was going to be violent. It was never going to be peaceful. It was not like, hey, give us your stuff. Okay, cool, bet. It was never gonna go like that, and we've seen examples of this moment within the concept of communism in history. It's just the last part we never get to see. So, in the socialist revolutions, you would see that a proletariat would rise up and take all of the government's power and financial assets from the bourgeoisie, and then they would take over in what would be a temporary dictatorial role, so like a dictator, but only for a little while. Now, some of you might be laughing in this moment because you realize it never just lasts a little while. It's always a long while, and that's how long it lasts. But we'll get to that part in a minute. So this was the third tier of the staircase of politics that Marxists would believe in. Now, in actual human history, we've never seen it actually go beyond this step. So if we go with Castro's Cuba, Mao Zedong's China, Lenin and Trotsky's Russia, Soviet Union, if we go to Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, if we go to Kim Il Sung, Kim Jong Un, Kim Jong Il in North Korea, none of them ever got to the last stage. They get to this part and they kind of just stop because, unfortunately, when you think back to Enlightenment thinkers like Hobbes, it's not in human nature, right? We're kind of greedy creatures. Once we have power, are you really going to give it up? It's kind of hard to do so. If you had the Infinity Gauntlet, would you snap your finger once and then just and you can get whatever you want? Would you give it away? Some of you might, but let's be fair. Snickers, 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 nonstop, boy. Lose weight, more Snickers. It would be I would never let that thing go ever. Okay. To be fair though, the Infinity Gauntlet probably wouldn't fit me anyway. However, here's the next step. So the idea is, and under the socialist concept, is that they would redistribute these funds. So let's just say that they actually did this and they actually got through with their plans and said, okay, fine, we've collected all the assets of our government and financial assets from the bourgeoisie. It is now time to hand it back to the proletariat. So let's just say they actually do this. Here's the problem. What's the incentive? So we get to the final boss stage, and we call this communism. This is what they call the utopian state, the idea that there is no class, there is no proletariat, there is no bourgeoisie, everybody's equal, a doctor, a baker, a lawyer, a candlestick maker, everybody's the same. Everybody gets treated equally. We wouldn't even need money. Money would be not necessary because we would just trade services. Hey, I'll fix your broken tooth if you go and get me a bag of pickles. Whatever the situation is, we don't need money anymore. That would be a thing of the past. War would be a thing of the past. There would be no war because everybody's the same and everybody's equal, and there's no class struggle that we would have wars over. So we would not have to fight over territory, space, money, or any manufactured goods, raw materials, because everybody shares and everybody's fine. It sounds like we're all in this together. Cue the Zac Efron music. But in reality, does this seem practical? Does this seem realistic? So when we talk about it from a Western centric point of view, an American centric point of view, this all just seems like cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. This seems like a very nice idea. Like, oh, that's a great idea. However, it's not really practical, and we haven't seen it ever flourish yet, and nor do we probably likely will ever see it because communism had its really big push in the mid to late 20th century, and it's kind of starting to go out of fashion now. However, it was really important because what communism would ultimately do is set the stage for what's to come next. And what's coming next is a very large war in terms of whose idea is best and whose idea is going to hold the most influence in the rest of the world. And we would see the rise of multiple different factions of groups who would either challenge this notion or go along with this notion. Now, keep in mind the ideas of capitalism and democracy versus socialist ideas and communism, those weren't the only two mentalities that were going to be born in this era, because other things will come from this. We'll get into the authoritarian governments like Mussolini and Hitler that we're going to see form on the right side of the political spectrum, along with communism forming on the left side. We're going to see some very unfortunate systems of government that are going to come from this time, because class structure is going to become a very noticeable problem in much of the West, where it was not really before, because most people were just poor, right? I mean, when we look at the French Revolution, the vast majority of the citizens were just poor. Americans mostly just poor. English mostly just poor. But now we're going to start to see what happens when there's haves and have-nots in non-royal roles and non hierarchical family lineage based positions of power. People can rise up and then take claim of their items. And what's going to happen when there's an entire group of people who have a completely different worldview from you, right? So when the Soviet Union rises, it's going to have a very different turn. So we need to remember a couple things. So let's kind of go back and recap and review. The age of industrialization got us to this point. It created a system where you're going to have some people who are far more against the treatment of workers, the conditions workers live in, the conditions a society is in, so much so that they would want a fundamental shift away from what they have always known their whole lives. Then there would be some who say, sure, what if we put some restrictions in? What if we make some slight alterations to capitalism? It would be in the world's best interest, because at that point, people would have an incentive to work. The harder you work, the more you get, the more you get, the more you achieve, the more you achieve, the better off you'll be. And it gives people the means to work. So we're going to see these very fundamental, not just economic, but political and societally structured ideas come into play. So for your test, be sure you know that hierarchy step. So let's go over it one more time. Feudalism, the idea of kings and queens owning the land that people live on. You give fealty to your king in order to be protected by them. The next step would be capitalism. Give people the incentive to work, and survival of the fittest would kick in. Those who would be good would thrive, those who would be weak would perish. It would not go well for those who did not have any. Eventually, there would need to be a rise of those who did not have any to overthrow those who had it, which would be the system of socialism, which is the proletariat rising up, overthrowing the bourgeoisie, and then garnering all the power and collecting it and coalescing it into one place, creating a small time temporary dictatorship. And eventually we get to the utopian state, the final stage, which is communism, where there is no class structure. Everybody's treated equally. Money, wars, all that no longer exists. So clearly, we've never seen that in the real world. We've never seen a society that runs with no money and never gets into fights. I mean, it sounds like a great idea, but is it practical? So that's where I'm going to leave you off with tonight. I wanted to make it kind of quick and easy. This is, I don't know, like 15 minutes, something like that. It's enough to kind of get you guys to get ready for this. So just remember that step. I think if you know those stairs, that's going to be helpful. Just know Karl Marx and what his ideas were. The fact that, I mean, remember, his ideas were created in the 1840s, and they didn't really catch wind and catch fire until about the 1880s. That's really about 30 or 40 years after uh, Industrial Revolution Part 2 really kicks in pretty hard, and people are starting to notice the consequences of unfiltered capitalism, which is about the time when the government starts to say, hey, we should probably pump the brakes here on this laissez-faire policy. Remember, laissez-faire means government gets little involved in terms of economic affairs. We should probably put a rule here or there and kind of keep a little restriction. So, ladies and gentlemen, hopefully this helps. I try to get a video out as fast as I can. I kind of speed run this compared to the last video. The last one I made over the weekend was going to be like 25 minutes, but I felt I kind of rambled. So I think this is a little bit more concise. Again, prepare for the test that's on Wednesday. You guys will be fine. I'm sure you'll do good. So hopefully this helped. Hopefully you enjoyed this. Hopefully this red spot from the lights in my living room aren't super distracting. They were distracting me this whole time. So anyhow, have a good night. Hopefully you watch this, review this as much as you can, and make sure you like and subscribe. That way you know when the videos drop. I mean, you should anyway, because you're going to go to AP World at some point, and maybe you can watch these again in the future. Okay, bye.